Your best friend could be your worst enemy. That thought might sound harsh, but it's exactly what Aristotle discovered over 2,300 years ago when he started looking deeper into friendship. This wasn't just some random idea he had. Aristotle spent years watching how people formed relationships in ancient Athens, and what he found was pretty disturbing. He noticed that most of what people called friendship wasn't friendship at all. It was more like a convenient arrangement, a deal between two people who were just using each other. And the worst part? Not much has changed since then. Think about your own friends for a moment. How many of them would stick around if you lost your job, moved away, or couldn't offer them anything anymore? Aristotle saw this same pattern in ancient Greece, and it bothered him so much that he wrote an entire book about it in his Ethics. What he discovered about friendship might make you question every relationship you have. But it's not just about spotting fake friends. Aristotle cracked open something deeper. He exposed how our whole understanding of friendship is built on shaky ground. The way we chase after connections, build our social circles, and measure our popularity. He'd say we're doing it all wrong, and he'd probably be horrified by how social media has made everything even worse. Let's dive into what Aristotle actually found when he started categorizing different types of friends. First up, there's what he called friendship of utility. These are the friends who are in your life because they get something out of it. In ancient Athens, these were the merchants who acted buddy-buddy with each other to get better trade deals, or politicians who formed alliances to gain power. Today, it's that colleague who only talks to you because you might help them get promoted. It's that person in your DMs who only reaches out when they need a favor. Aristotle nailed it. These relationships dissolve the moment the benefit disappears. Then there's the friendship of pleasure, and this one hits close to home in our entertainment-obsessed world. These are your party friends, the ones who are fun to be around but disappear when things get tough. In ancient Greece, these were the drinking buddies at symposiums, the people who hung out at the gymnasiums together. Today, they're your Instagram followers, your gaming squad, the friends you only see at bars or social events. Aristotle noticed these friendships tend to fade fast, especially as people's interests change. Think about your high school friends. How many of them do you still talk to? The ones who drifted away were probably pleasure friends. But here's where it gets really interesting. Aristotle believed there was a third type of friendship, what he called perfect friendship, or friendship of virtue. This is the real deal. The kind of friendship that's so rare most people never experience it in their entire lives. It's not based on what someone can do for you or how fun they are to be around. Instead, it's based on recognizing and appreciating the actual goodness in another person. In ancient Athens, Aristotle saw how rare these relationships were. He watched as supposed best friends betrayed each other for money or power. He observed how quickly social circles changed when someone's status shifted. The same patterns play out today. Just look at any celebrity who lost their fame, or anyone who's gone through hard times. The crowd of friends usually thins out pretty quickly. The really fascinating part is how Aristotle connected this to human nature. He realized that most people aren't even capable of forming perfect friendships because they're not focused on becoming better people themselves. They're too busy chasing pleasure, money, or status. He saw this in the busy markets of Athens, where merchants formed fake friendships to make more money. He noticed it in the political assembly, where alliances shifted based on power. And he definitely would have recognized it in our modern world of networking events, social media connections, and transactional relationships. This is just the beginning of what Aristotle discovered about friendship, and trust me, it gets even more eye-opening from here. The conclusions he reached about why most friendships fail and what it actually takes to build a real one might completely change how you look at your own relationships. Now let's get into the harsh reality of what Aristotle discovered about friendship. And fair warning, this might sting a bit. Remember those 3 types of friendship we talked about? Well, Aristotle did the math and he figured out something pretty shocking. About 90% of what we call friendships are actually just temporary arrangements that are destined to fail. Think about your LinkedIn connections or your Facebook friends. You might have hundreds or even thousands of them. Aristotle would laugh at that. He'd say it's mathematically impossible to maintain that many real friendships. In fact, he noticed that even in ancient Athens, where people weren't distracted by phones and social media. Most people could only maintain a handful of genuine connections. Here's where it gets really interesting. Aristotle started noticing patterns in how fake friendships fall apart. Those utility friendships? He watched them crumble in Athens all the time. Two merchants would be best buddies while business was good. But the moment one of them found a better deal elsewhere, suddenly that friendship meant nothing. We see the exact same thing today. Remember that work friend who used to have lunch with you every day? The one who mysteriously stopped talking to you after they got promoted? That's exactly what Aristotle was talking about. But the pleasure friendships might be even more painful to look at. Aristotle saw how young people in Athens would form intense friendships based on shared fun. Drinking together, exercising at the gymnasium, attending festivals. Sound familiar? It's like your college friendships. You think these people will be in your life forever because every moment together is amazing. Then graduation happens. People move away. Suddenly, those unbreakable bonds start breaking pretty easily. Aristotle noticed something really specific about pleasure friendships. They have an expiration date. In Athens, he saw how friends who bonded over physical beauty or athletic ability drifted apart as they aged. Today, we see the same pattern with party friends. The moment someone stops going out, starts a family, or just changes their lifestyle, those supposedly solid friendships start evaporating. Here's a brutal truth Aristotle figured out. Most people actually prefer these shallow friendships. Why? Because real friendship is hard work. In Athens, he watched people actively choose easier, superficial relationships over deeper ones. They'd rather have a large circle of casual friends than put in the effort to build something real. Social media has made this even worse. We can maintain the illusion of hundreds of friendships without ever having to deal with the messy, challenging parts of real connection. And it gets even more complicated. Aristotle realized that most people can't form true friendships because they don't even like themselves enough. He saw this play out in Athens. People who were constantly chasing money, status, or pleasure couldn't form deep friendships because they were too unstable themselves. They'd change their personality based on who they were with, just like people do today on different social media platforms. The numbers Aristotle crunched were pretty depressing. He estimated that maybe 1 in 20 friendships had the potential to become something real. And even then, most of those would fail because people weren't willing to put in the time and effort required. He watched countless close friendships in Athens fall apart because people weren't willing to have difficult conversations, show up during tough times, or maintain the connection when it wasn't convenient anymore. This is where modern research actually backs up what Aristotle saw. Studies show that it takes about 200 hours of interaction to form a close friendship. That's like spending 50 4-hour chunks of quality time together. In our busy world, how many people are we actually willing to invest that kind of time in? Aristotle would say that's exactly why real friendships are so rare. We want the reward without the investment. Let's talk about what Aristotle said makes a true friendship, and why it's so incredibly rare to find one. After studying friendships for years in Athens, he came up with some pretty intense requirements for what makes a perfect friendship. And honestly, once you hear them, you'll understand why most of us never experience one. First up, there's the time requirement. Aristotle said true friendship is like watching salt dissolve in water. It has to happen slowly. In ancient Athens, he noticed that the friendships that lasted weren't the instant connections made at parties or business meetings. They were the ones that developed over years of shared experiences. He actually said you need to eat a sack of salt together before calling someone a true friend. That's about 1 kg of salt. And back then, eating that much salt together meant sharing roughly 200 meals. Think about how many meals you've actually shared with your so-called best friends. But here's where it gets even trickier. Aristotle said true friends need to have aligned characters, not just similar interests or compatible personalities, but actual moral alignment. He watched how friendships in Athens fell apart when people's values clashed, even if they enjoyed each other's company. It's like having a friend who starts doing something you consider morally wrong. You might try to maintain the friendship, but that fundamental disagreement will always create distance. The mutual growth part is fascinating. Aristotle believed true friends should make each other better people, not in a superficial way, like motivating each other to go to the gym. But in terms of becoming more virtuous human beings, he saw this rarely happen in Athens because most people were too focused on pleasure or success to care about moral improvement. Sound familiar? Today, we're more likely to have friends who encourage our bad habits than ones who challenge us to be better people. Here's a mind-bending observation Aristotle made. Most people can't form true friendships because they're not true friends to themselves. He noticed in Athens how people who were constantly changing their opinions, values, and behaviors based on who they were around couldn't maintain deep friendships. They didn't have a solid enough sense of self. Think about how social media makes us perform different versions of ourselves. Aristotle would say that makes true friendship almost impossible. The shared virtues part is particularly demanding. Aristotle said true friends need to actively practice being good people together. In Athens, he saw how rare this was. Most people were too busy chasing wealth, status, or pleasure to focus on developing virtue. He'd probably say the same about us today. How many of your friendships are based on making each other morally better people? And here's the paradox that really messed with people's heads in Athens. Aristotle noticed that actively trying to find true friendship often prevents you from finding it. Why? Because seeking friendship for its own sake turns it into another pleasure or utility relationship. The deepest friendships in Athens usually developed naturally between people who were focused on becoming better humans, not on finding friends. The modern world makes all of this even harder. We're constantly moving cities, changing jobs, and maintaining surface-level connections through social media. Aristotle would say we're setting ourselves up for failure. In Athens, he saw how stability was crucial for deep friendships to develop. Today, we barely stay in one place or situation long enough to share that metaphorical sack of salt with anyone. This might sound depressing, but Aristotle wasn't trying to discourage people. He was showing us why true friendship is so valuable precisely because it's so rare. In Athens, he saw how the few people who managed to form real friendships had something almost magical, a connection that made them better, stronger, and more fulfilled human beings. Let's get to the deeper truth about what all this means for us today. Aristotle's insights about friendship aren't just some ancient philosophy. They're a mirror showing us exactly why we feel so disconnected, despite being more connected than ever. Think about it. We're living in a world Aristotle couldn't have imagined. We've got thousands of friends on social media, endless ways to stay in touch, and more opportunities to meet people than ever before. Yet studies show loneliness is at an all-time high. Aristotle would look at this and say, well, obviously, because he figured out that having more connections actually makes it harder to form real friendships. Here's what's really messing us up. We're treating friendship like a numbers game. Aristotle watched the same thing happen in Athens. People would brag about how many drinking buddies they had, how many business connections they'd made. Sound familiar? It's like counting Instagram followers or LinkedIn connections today. But here's the brutal math Aristotle worked out. The more time you spend maintaining shallow friendships, the less time you have for deep ones. But let's get practical about what this means for your life. Aristotle would say it's time to do a friendship audit. Look at your phone right now. How many of your contacts would show up if you needed help moving at 7 a.m. on a Sunday? How many would sit with you in a hospital waiting room? How many would tell you the hard truth when you're messing up your life? That's the difference between what Aristotle calls a true friend and just someone you hang out with. The really interesting part is how Aristotle's ideas explain why friendship seems harder as we get older. In Athens, he noticed that people become more selective about friendships as they age, not because they're antisocial, but because they've learned the hard way that most friendships aren't worth the investment. Think about how many best friends forever from high school or college aren't even in your life anymore. Here's a mind-bending thought. Aristotle would say that social media has made true friendship nearly impossible. Why? Because we're constantly performing versions of ourselves online. How can you form a real connection when you're not even showing your real self? In Athens, he saw how people who were always trying to maintain a public image struggled to form deep friendships. Today, we're all doing that 24/7 on social media. But there's hope in what Aristotle discovered. He found that understanding these harsh truths about friendship actually helps you build better relationships. When you stop expecting every friend to be a true friend, you can appreciate different types of friendships for what they are. Your gym buddy doesn't need to be your philosophical soulmate. Your work friend doesn't need to be your emotional support system. The real power move, according to Aristotle, is focusing your energy on the few friendships that have the potential to be something deeper. He saw in Athens how the happiest people weren't those with the most friends, but those with a few real ones. It's like having a few well-made tools instead of a garage full of cheap ones that break when you need them. Maybe the most comforting thing Aristotle figured out is this: it's normal to have only a couple of true friends in your lifetime. In fact, he'd say if you have more than that, you're probably fooling yourself. But those few real friendships, they're worth more than 1,000 superficial ones. So next time you're feeling bad about not having hundreds of close friends, remember what Aristotle discovered. The path to true friendship isn't about collecting more connections. It's about having the courage to invest deeply in the few relationships that really matter. Because in the end, one friend who makes you a better person is worth more than 1,000 who just keep you entertained. What can we actually do with all this knowledge about friendship that Aristotle uncovered? Well, first off, we need to be real with ourselves. Most of our friendships aren't going to be those deep, perfect connections, and that's okay. Those work friends, gym buddies, and social media connections still have their place. They make life more enjoyable, help us get things done, and add variety to our social world. But here's where Aristotle's wisdom really hits home. Knowing the difference between these types of friendships is what saves us from disappointment. When that work friend stops hanging out after changing jobs, or that party friend disappears when you stop going to clubs, it won't crush you, because you'll understand that's just the natural life cycle of utility and pleasure friendships. Aristotle noticed something pretty profound in Athens. The people who were most disappointed in friendship were the ones who expected every friendship to be deep and lasting. It's like being upset that every person you date doesn't become your soulmate. Having realistic expectations actually makes all your relationships better, because you're not putting pressure on them to be something they're not. Think about your own friendships right now. Maybe you've got hundreds of social media connections, dozens of people you hang out with, but only one or two people who really know you. Aristotle would say that's not just normal, it's optimal. Those one or two true friendships, they're rare because they're supposed to be rare. They require so much time, energy, and authentic connection that having more than a few would be impossible. But here's the really powerful part of what Aristotle discovered. When you stop chasing quantity in friendship and start focusing on quality, something amazing happens. You actually become capable of deeper connections. You start paying attention to character instead of just compatibility. You look for friends who make you want to be better, not just friends who make you feel good. The truth about friendship isn't actually terrible, it's liberating. Understanding that most friendships are temporary doesn't make them meaningless. It just helps you appreciate them for what they are. Those casual friends who make you laugh, those workout buddies who keep you motivated, those colleagues who make work more bearable, they all add value to your life. They're not fake friends, they're just different types of friends. And those rare, true friendships, knowing how special they are makes you appreciate them even more. When you find someone who sticks with you through changes, challenges you to grow, and loves you for who you really are, that's not just friendship. That's what Aristotle would call one of life's greatest achievements. So maybe it's time we stopped measuring friendship by numbers. Stop worrying about how many friends you have on Facebook or how many people came to your last party. Instead, focus on nurturing those few relationships that have the potential for depth. Be the kind of friend who shows up when it's hard, who tells the truth even when it's uncomfortable, who helps others become better versions of themselves. Because in the end, Aristotle was right. True friendship isn't about having lots of friends. It's about having the right ones. And sometimes, one real friend is worth more than 1,000 acquaintances. That's not a terrible truth about friendship. That's the beautiful reality of what friendship can be when we understand what it really means. Remember, your Instagram following doesn't define your social success. Your friend count doesn't measure your worth. What matters is having those few, precious connections where you can be completely yourself, grow together, and build something that lasts. That's what Aristotle discovered 300 years ago, and it's still true today. Quality over quantity isn't just a saying, it's the secret to real friendship.